You have been sold a masterpiece of marketing. For years, the prevailing consensus has dictated that global metropolises are permanent. We were told that once a city achieves the status of the world's default operating system, its gravity becomes absolute. The conventional wisdom insists that talent and capital possess no viable alternatives to the historic centers of the Western Hemisphere. But the data tells a very different story. It tells us that structural dominance is not a permanent state of being, but a temporary alignment of mechanics, and those mechanics are systematically unlocking to see it. You have to look past the calculated optimism of the real estate brochures and the sterilized metrics of official press releases. You have to look at the physical reality of the pavement. If you walk down New Bond Street on a Tuesday afternoon, historically one of the tightest, most aggressively contested strips of commercial luxury real estate on Earth, you notice things that shouldn't be there. You see dark windows, not the temporary wooden hoardings that signal a high-profile luxury brand is remodeling its flagship, but raw, empty retail units left completely bare. In a corridor where 5 years ago a lease could not be secured for any price, where waiting lists were measured in half decades, these blank spaces are being met with practiced deflections. Commercial agents speak comfortably about transitional macroeconomic cycles and post-pandemic retail recalibration, but the physical world does not lie. When the most expensive dirt in Europe starts producing dark windows, it is not a cyclical blip. It is a structural warning light. Why is this happening now? Because London's foundational economic model was never based on production, it was based on aggregation. For over 2 centuries under the formal empire, and for another 70 years through the financial architecture that outlived it, the city functioned as an incredibly sophisticated extraction machine. It drew raw capital, global talent, and institutional legitimacy from every geographic quadrant and concentrated them into a single high-density metropolitan basin. The ancient self-governing square mile of the City of London operated as the ultimate clearinghouse. If a tech founder in Mumbai wanted validation from European pension funds, she moved her corporate headquarters to Shoreditch. If a sovereign wealth fund in East Asia wanted to deploy billions safely, the transaction was routed through a British law firm. London did not need to manufacture anything of tangible mass. It simply needed to be the place where the people who did build things came to purchase legitimacy. That entire framework of aggregation is experiencing a profound mechanical failure. Consider the raw velocity of the migration data. Between 2017 and 2023, the United Kingdom suffered a larger net loss of high-net-worth individuals than any other nation in Western Europe. According to data compiled by the Center for Economics and Business Research, in 2023 alone, more than 10,000 millionaires permanently relocated their primary residences away from Britain, with the overwhelming majority of that departure originating directly from the luxury residential enclaves of London. This was not a minor statistical fluctuation. It represented a massive 42% acceleration over the flight recorded the previous year. When capital exits a metropolitan center at that specific speed, it triggers a devastating structural cascade. The wealth does not leave in isolation. It carries with it the specialized corporate lawyers who structured the international portfolios. It pulls away the private art advisors, the multifamily offices, the boutique wealth management firms, and the bespoke accountants. It starves the ultra-high-end hospitality sector that relied on that specific density of discretionary spending, and it hollows out the private academies, where these families previously enrolled their heirs. The flight of the ultra-wealthy is never an isolated event. It is a systemic unraveling of an entire hyper-specialized service economy. The destination of this departing capital reveals exactly how obsolete London's monopolistic infrastructure has become. These individuals did not disperse into random geographic anomalies. They executed highly calculated relocations to jurisdictions that have spent decades intentionally building the machinery to replace the British capital. Dubai absorbed the single largest cohort of this wealth, offering an entire ecosystem designed specifically for capital protection and zero-tax aggregation. Monaco captured those requiring proximity to European time zones without exposure to the European Union's regulatory oversight, while Milan, Zurich, and Singapore systematically absorbed the financial routing that once belonged exclusively to the banks of the Thames. These were institutional decisions executed by individuals with the liquid resources to inhabit any point on the globe. They evaluated the escalating friction of operating out of London and concluded that the staggering cost of admission no longer yielded an acceptable return. But wealth flight on its own is merely a symptom of a deeper structural rot. A city can lose its billionaire class and survive, adapting its economy to find balance. What elevates this specific moment from a standard story of capital flight into a case study of permanent civilizational decline is what is simultaneously occurring within the foundational layers of the city's demographic pyramid. London is not just losing its financial elite, it is aggressively purging its middle class. And it is systematically burning through its young talent. The structural metrics provided by the Office for National Statistics reveal a reality that no marketing campaign can counter. Between 2019 and 2022, London's vital demographic core, young professionals aged between 25 and 34, declined by more than 80,000 individuals. These were not international oligarchs hiding assets in shell corporations. These were the mid-career architects, software engineers, investigative journalists, and senior researchers who historically provided the city with its intellectual baseline and creative renewal. They arrived in the metropolis operating under the traditional assumption that London consistently rewarded intense professional ambition. They departed because the city's internal economy has mutated into something fundamentally unlivable. By the conclusion of 2023, the average monthly rent for a standard, one-bedroom apartment in London breached the £2,000 threshold for the first time in recorded history. To understand the true weight of that number, it must be viewed in context with local compensation scales. £2,000 per month represents approximately 68% of the average net after-tax monthly income of a mid-career professional in their late 20s. When an urban ecosystem consumes nearly 70% of a young worker's disposable income merely to secure basic shelter, it ceases to function as a talent incubator. Instead, it transforms into an economic filter that exclusively rewards inherited wealth while aggressively driving away organic capability. And when a city systematically expels its working talent, it quickly discovers that the talent was the only thing rendering its premium real estate valuable in the first place. This is the classic signature of institutional blindness, the phase where an establishment recognizes individual symptoms but explicitly refuses to diagnose the underlying disease. For more than a decade, each structural failure has been compartmentalized by the mainstream narrative. The acute housing crisis was framed as a temporary supply-side bottleneck. The abrupt departure of thousands of specialized European professionals following the Brexit referendum was dismissed as a minor administrative transition. The subsequent migration of major hedge funds, asset managers, and euro-denominated trading desks to alternative hubs like Paris, Amsterdam, and Dublin was categorized as an emotional overreaction. Every single piece of evidence was isolated, explained away, and neutralized by the press. What the institutional commentary carefully avoided was the single obligation of genuine systemic analysis. Stepping back to look at how these independent fractures align into a definitive historical sequence. They form the exact structural arc that has preceded the stagnation of every major financial capital in modern history. And this is only the beginning of what the data reveals. We are currently witnessing a profound institutional paradox, a decline that is entirely visible to anyone walking the street, yet systematically denied by every organ of the official narrative. If you look at the promotional materials distributed by municipal development boards, you are presented with a glossy, frictionless rendering of a hyper-modern metropolis that is supposedly expanding its global influence. The marketing copy remains unyielding in its insistence that the city's dominance is structurally unassailable. Yet, this wall of public optimism operates as a defensive perimeter designed to conceal an underlying reality that the establishment is deeply terrified to acknowledge. The official narrative has detached itself completely from the material conditions of the city, creating an environment where the expression of structural truth has become a distinct professional liability. This divergence has produced a profound chilling effect across the entire analytical landscape. In the boardrooms of major corporate real estate firms and within the research departments of institutional banks, there is an unspoken agreement to sanitize the language of reporting. Analysts who privately acknowledge that structural trends have turned permanently negative are forced to filter their findings through a vocabulary of artificial resilience, hard data regarding falling transaction volumes, structural tax shortfalls, and systemic capital flight is routinely spun as market consolidation or anticipatory stabilization. The data is being managed because the truth threatens the valuation of billions of dollars in vulnerable urban assets. When internal engineering surveys indicate that the transport network requires a capital injection that the municipal tax base can no longer generate, the public announcements speak abstractly of efficiency optimization. When international financial institutions quietly reallocate their primary risk assessment teams from the banks of the Thames to continental Europe, the public relation firms frame the move as an expansion of their global footprint rather than a structural retreat. The real danger is not that the establishment is ignorant of the decay, it is that they are entirely aware of it and have calculated that their only survival mechanism is the aggressive maintenance of the illusion. When you zoom out from the localized symptoms, the broader systemic implications of this hollowing process become chillingly clear. For decades, the entire nation operated under a centralized economic model that treated its primary financial capital as an infinite fiscal engine. The rest of the country's public infrastructure, its regional hospitals, its municipal services, its social safety nets, was directly subsidized by the immense tax yields generated within a single hyper-concentrated metropolitan basin. The structural decline of that basin does not remain confined within its borders. It triggers an immediate systemic fiscal crisis for the entire state apparatus, as the high net worth tax base contracts and the productivity of the professional middle class is systematically consumed by basic survival costs. The state's fiscal capacity begins to shrink precisely when the demands on its aging public services are reaching an all-time high. If this structural trajectory continues uninterrupted, the long-term consequence is not a sudden cinematic collapse, but a permanent transition into systemic provincialization. The metropolis ceases to function as an engine of global consequence and instead becomes an enormous, hyper-expensive administrative burden. The wider region is left tied to a core that can no longer fund itself, let alone project the economic power required to influence international markets. The institutional frameworks that once defined global commerce are gradually reduced to historical artifacts, maintained for the benefit of tourism, but entirely stripped of their operational authority. The wider system enters a phase of compounding exhaustion, where each subsequent policy adjustment is forced to manage a progressively diminishing pool of resources. The true measure of a city's decline is not the presence of visible ruin, but the total absence of the capacity to self-correct. This leaves us with a reality that cannot be resolved by standard political cycles or minor legislative adjustments. The structural mechanics that once allowed a single geographic point to command global flows of wealth and intellect have unlocked, and they are reassembling themselves in far more adaptable configurations across the globe. The buildings still stand, the historic architecture remains impeccable, and the cultural prestige continues to project a powerful surface echo of greatness. But the core function, the invisible energy that made this specific coordinate the undisputed operating system of the world, is quietly departing through the dark windows of its premier streets and the silent data migrations of its financial institutions, which forces us to look past the carefully curated statements of the establishment and confront the only question that truly matters for the decade ahead. What happens to a civilization when its most historic heart ceases to be an engine of the future and transforms permanently into a monument to its own